Think about what the purpose of a lesson or a lecture actually is. These are things that are so central to your learning and take up so many hours of actual contact time, and nobody even stops to think about what their purpose and objective is in the grand scheme of things. Those are the questions that I began to ask myself, and I want to go through with you what I observed and what I found out and how that clarifies what you should be doing in lessons and how to actually do that. In schools, lessons are usually split up into multiple segments. You have a kind of lecture phase and a practice phase, and I want to focus specifically on that lecture phase in today's video, because the lecture phase has one dominant and clear underlying objective, and that is the transfer of information. And that objective arises as a historical constraint rather than a learning constraint or an optimization constraint. What do I mean by that? Well, lesson plans were designed in a time where information was scarce and highly valuable. That made it very practical and very easy to simply sit in on a lesson and be able to passively be taught explicitly what you actually need to know. There is no other place where the information that you are being taught actually comes from than this lesson. But the world doesn't look like that anymore. And you've probably heard this over and over again. And the reality of the situation is that information is incredibly cheap and available and accessible. Not only this, but the other thing that people will usually say about lessons is that it is having access to the expert in and of itself that gives it value. That being able to ask an expert questions, specifically tailored questions that you have that are personal, is in and of itself valuable. And that's not true anymore either. AI means that you have both a personalized expert on every topic known to humankind, as well as enough information that you could never learn in an entire lifetime. And people will highlight quite irrelevant critiques of AI for your purposes. Unless you are on the actual brink of advancements in specific fields of knowledge as a PhD student or a researcher, AI has more information than anyone will ever realistically be able to use and need on any topic that you could possibly want. There are, however, some reasonable criticisms of AI. However, these are more so criticisms of the user than the technology itself. Once you understand the meta skills of how to use a technology like AI, it becomes a far more powerful tool once again. But that's not the purpose of this video. This isn't a video about AI. So I'm going to leave that for now and go back to talking about lessons and the purpose of them and how they help you practically. Because you would think from everything that I've said that I'm essentially coming to the conclusion that lessons are pointless and you should be able to not go to them and be able to self-teach yourself everything you need at a quicker or more optimal rate than you otherwise would in lessons. And that's true, but it's also not true at the same time, and I'll explain why, because I want this video to be practical rather than philosophical. The reason that's not quite true for you specifically is because you still, whether you like it or not, are in an education system that is not designed around that. Whether that's more optimal or not is essentially an irrelevant point to you, because regardless of whether that's the case or not, that's not how the system is designed. This means that you have to consider the actual design of the system as a constraint to be able to maximize what you can actually do within it. It is far more difficult to actually self-motivate and self-teach an entire course alone when you do not have any sort of immediate incentive structure or feedback system that is imminent and daily relevant. Having something like an exam is not going to motivate you on the day-to-day, months in advance, to be doing something like self-teaching a topic. It's already difficult enough to motivate yourself to study something that you've been taught already. So what's the alternative? And crucially, what do you actually do in lessons and outside of lessons? You should not be taking long, detailed notes of everything. You should not be writing down and copying down full derivations or facts about anything. What you're basically doing is accepting that lessons are a form of information transfer, and you're just copying down a bunch of information. I don't remember the last time, once in a blue moon, that I would actually refer back to my notes. It's just not useful. Any information that I had written down in a lesson or a lecture was simply just information. It was readily available anywhere I wanted to find it online. But even though information is cheap, and the constraint of being within a system that is so heavily reliant on lessons and lectures means that you need to extract value from lessons which is outside of typical information gathering. Because there are things that you can draw from lessons. Meta questions about what will be important specifically for the purpose of an exam, what questions you need to be asking later to actually do learning, what information is relevant versus irrelevant. All of these kind of meta tasks and meta analysis of the subject, and trying to build a bigger picture as to where you should be targeting your learning, and therefore applying that later through practice papers, etc., is the value of the lesson. What that means is that for your purposes, lessons essentially become a free and passive way to familiarize yourself with everything that you need to kind of know about. This means that a structure that you can follow is to simply attend lectures and take notes of meta questions you could be asking yourself later. And in doing so, you familiarize yourself just by absorbing the lesson, what you actually need to kind of watch out for. The teacher, when you go back to doing any given thing, and I don't want you to basically do another lesson later, that's not what I mean. I'll talk about that more in a second, but when you're in the lesson, there are key moments, there are key things that kind of get highlighted in your mind subconsciously. And when you go back to doing, for example, practice questions about those things, you'll kind of retread those same steps, those highlighted sections that you had familiarized yourself with in lessons that are now coming up in a practical way, so that you can very specifically know what you need to learn to actually be able to effectively answer the question. So then any study structure that you're following should consist of those three major principles. You have the lesson itself, which is the familiarization of the content. Think about it as kind of warming yourself up to the water. You're not jumping straight into an ice cold bath. You're kind of slowly easing yourself in to a nice warm pool that you can still stand in, and then you're slowly but surely getting deeper into. Those are lessons. And then once you have familiarized yourself with the content, you can then attempt to do the practice questions, and do not limit yourself in thinking there is some more that you need to do. If it's covered in the lesson, then you should be attempting those questions. Once you keep adding prerequisites to actually attempting the questions, you simply stall forever. So you need to attempt those as soon as possible. And once you have attempted those, that's when the real learning takes place. Because now you know in a practical and objective sense what's important, what you understand and what you don't understand. And you use that information. And when I say that information, you should be making actual hard evidence of everything that you're doing. So, for example, taking notes of the different scores and questions that you did well and not well on. But that's, again, something I talk about in other videos. This is when you learn. People assume that you start with the learning and then do the thing. Whereas you have to start with the objective, and that's how you learn. So now that you know what you understand, what you don't understand, this is where you use something like an AI to go through in as much detail as you require for any given question, exactly these specific nitty-gritty details about what you didn't understand, and you ask it every single question until you fully understand that thing. As if you're a 5-year-old, you ask it common sense questions, you clarify, you contextualize, you simplify everything to the greatest of your ability. I hope you found that useful. This video was specifically about the misconceptions that people have about what lessons are and how to use them effectively and practically. And I didn't go into a great amount of detail about the specifics of separate things, like how to take notes of the questions you're doing and how to actually structure a session to do questions and then use AI to learn in. because that's not the purpose of this video. And if you do want more information about that, I strongly recommend you check out my other videos where I go into more details and have separate videos about each of the things that I've spoken about as entire separate videos. And while you're doing that, make sure to subscribe to the channel again so you can keep seeing those kinds of videos, as well as new videos about different topics and more expansions about the same kind of thing. That's all I have to say for today. Thank you. Have a nice day.